In Rome, morality was taxable. Every meal had a price, every flavor a limit. The lex orcia counted guests. The lex fania priced virtue at 100 asses. The lex didia outlawed pleasure itself. Inspectors raided villas, weighing meat like evidence. A senator could be punished, not for treason, but for too much wine. The law claimed to defend virtue. In truth, it was auditing desire. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Rome was supposed to be a republic of reason, but beneath the marble, it ran on hunger. Hunger for gold, for power, for spectacle. When soldiers returned from Carthage carrying ships of silver and crates of spices, the Senate panicked. Wealth meant indulgence, and indulgence looked dangerously close to disobedience. So they wrote a cure, legislation. In 182 BCE, the Lex Orcia decreed that no Roman could host more than a handful of guests at dinner. Modesty, they said, was a civic duty. Too many guests meant too many alliances. Too much laughter meant potential conspiracy. Dinner became surveillance in disguise. 70 years later came the Lex Fania, fixing a price ceiling of 100 asses per banquet, the cost of a cheap chicken and a cup of vinegar wine. The decree wasn't moral, it was mathematical. Virtue had a budget. Moderation could now be measured, audited, fined. It turned the dining table into a moral calculator, where appetite was tallied like debt. Then came the Lex Didia. It banned imported delicacies outright. No oysters, no peacocks, no flamingo tongues. Rome, an empire that imported everything, now feared its own taste. Luxury had become an enemy of discipline, and discipline was the Republic's last illusion of control. The inspectors, aediles, enforced these laws with fanatical precision. They stormed homes unannounced, counting chairs, weighing meat, sniffing sauces for foreign spice. Witnesses describe senators trembling under interrogation, wiping sweat while their servants hid silver platters behind false walls. Archaeologists have found their traces, hoards of buried tableware, secret kitchens under villas, and walls reinforced to conceal storage rooms. What Rome feared was not gluttony. It feared visibility. A man's wealth was a threat only when it could be seen. By forcing the rich to eat in secret, the Senate disguised its own hypocrisy. The same men who passed the laws hosted their illegal banquets in candlelit basements. They dined on contraband delicacies, toasting to virtue with imported wine. Every reform was a performance. The law became theatre, and the audience was the Republic itself, watching, judging, pretending. Behind each decree lay the same anxiety, that power, once full, might begin to rot. These were not food laws. They were purity tests. Rome wasn't regulating appetite. It was rehearsing obedience. And if dinner could become a crime, what would happen when the same gaze turned toward love? In 18 BCE, Augustus signed a law that declared war, not on enemies, but on intimacy. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis made adultery a crime against the state. Desire itself became treason. To understand why, you must picture Rome at its most insecure. The civil wars were over, but peace felt fragile. The city was rich, exhausted, and cynical. Senators bribed juries. Generals seduced soldiers. And the empire's moral backbone, its myth of discipline, was cracking. Augustus wanted order, but he understood something darker. People obey not through fear alone, but through guilt. So, he criminalized temptation. The new law turned the family into a miniature courtroom. Husbands were now legally required to report their unfaithful wives or face charges of complicity. Fathers gained divine authority. If they caught their daughter with a lover under their own roof, they could kill him on the spot. The state had deputized kinship. Blood ties became instruments of surveillance. For a civilization obsessed with lineage, this was a masterpiece of control. By binding family honor to the emperor's law, Augustus made every household a fragment of the state. Private life became public morality. Desire was no longer personal, it was imperial property. The punishment was exile, the Roman version of slow erasure. Convicted adulterers were stripped of wealth, banished to separate islands, and forbidden to contact each other again. He to one, she to another, each a moral quarantine. The Mediterranean, once a sea of trade, became an archipelago of shame. But the law's cruelty was selective. Men who strayed faced fines or loss of status, women annihilation. The double standard wasn't hypocrisy, it was policy. Rome's stability depended on female chastity because inheritance depended on certainty. The empire feared nothing more than a child of mixed blood claiming noble rights. Behind the rhetoric of virtue lay economic terror. Property must flow cleanly from father to son, untainted by doubt. When Augustus's own daughter, Julia, became famous for her wit, beauty, and lovers, the empire trembled with irony. She was the living contradiction of her father's ideals, a woman whose charisma rivaled his authority. For years, he ignored the rumors. Then, as they spread into satire and graffiti, Augustus invoked his own law. Julia was arrested, stripped of jewels, and shipped off to a barren island. Her name erased from public prayers. To the Senate, it was moral clarity. To the people, it was theater, proof that no one, not even the emperor's blood, stood above the law. But the punishment did not restore virtue. It broadcast control. Augustus had learned that spectacle was more powerful than sincerity. The Lex Julia worked because it replaced shame with procedure. Sin was no longer a whisper, it was paperwork. Rome didn't need to stop adultery. It only needed to measure it, record it, and make citizens complicit in their own policing. And so began the empire's obsession with documenting desire. Informers flourished. Neighbors, slaves, even relatives traded secrets for reward. Accusation became a civic duty. Women's bodies became political property, and men's reputations depended on their vigilance. The household transformed into a surveillance unit. We often imagine Rome as a land of decadence, orgies, feasts, and scandalous murals. But those were symptoms, not sins. The real decadence was bureaucratic. It wasn't the body that was corrupt. It was the law's fascination with controlling it. Augustus presented himself as Pater Patriae, the father of the nation. It was a title both affectionate and terrifying. A father disciplines, a father watches. Under his rule, virtue became filial obedience. To love someone without permission was to betray the empire's patriarch. The poets mocked him, of course. Ovid, sly and unrepentant, published The Art of Love, a guidebook for surviving and subverting the emperor's morality. For that, he was exiled too. Proof that Rome's first true censorship was not of words, but of desire itself. Yet, the paradox remained. Every act of repression deepened fascination. Statues, graffiti, and elegies about forbidden love spread faster than the laws meant to silence them. The empire that outlawed pleasure became addicted to its shadow. There is a strange brilliance in the Lex Julia. It shows how an empire, convinced of its superiority, begins to fear its own reflection. The law's real purpose was never purity, it was performance. By legislating virtue, Rome confessed it had lost it. The deeper question is this: why did obedience require humiliation? Augustus didn't just want loyalty, he wanted moral submission. By turning the bedroom into a courtroom, he made every citizen internalize the gaze of the state. The empire's survival no longer depended on legions, but on conscience. And that was its most enduring invention: the self-policing soul. Rome built not just roads and aqueducts, but the architecture of guilt. From that point on, every empire would inherit the template: control the family, criminalize desire, disguise discipline as virtue. Augustus may have died 2,000 years ago, but his system did not. Today, we still call it morality. In Rome, even the dead had boundaries. The lex de sepulchris et tumulus, the law of tombs, declared that no corpse, no urn, not even a handful of ashes could rest inside the city. Death was contamination. It had to be exiled like treason. This was not superstition, it was governance disguised as holiness. The Romans believed that corpses polluted both the air and the gods. The sacred boundary of the city, the pomerium, had to remain untouched, eternally alive. Death belonged beyond the walls, out where silence began. Walk the Appian Way today, and you can still see the consequences. Endless tombs lining the road like sentinels of memory. Marble faces stare at travelers, carved smiles frozen in their last performance. Each monument is a paradox, a citizen banned from Rome, yet desperate to be seen by it. For the wealthy, exclusion became spectacle. They turned death into architecture. Their tombs were advertisements, engraved resumes, boasting of titles, battles, and virtues. In a city that forbade corpses, the elite built immortality on the threshold. They could not die in Rome, so they made sure they would be remembered by Rome. The poor had no such consolation. Without property, their bodies were dumped beyond the Esquiline Gate in mass pits known as puticuli. Writers described them as chasms of decay, thousands of corpses piled together, gnawed by dogs and vultures. The stench drifted back toward the city on hot days. The law that claimed to preserve purity had created a moat of rot. Sanitation masked hierarchy. The same empire that built aqueducts to feed its fountains also built charnel grounds to contain its poor. The lex de sepulchris did not simply protect the living from disease, it protected the elite from the sight of their own mortality. Because visibility was everything in Rome, a corpse was not just a body, it was a statement. A poor man's unburied flesh was a reminder that equality, like virtue, was a fiction. By exiling death, the Senate tried to exile decay from the idea of empire itself. The rule was enforced with chilling precision. Gravediggers, priests, and mourners had to follow ritualized routes leading away from the city. Any burial within the pomerium risked confiscation of property or even death for defiance. When plague struck, exemptions were granted only for soldiers who died in victory. The only acceptable decay was heroic. The contradiction was staggering. Rome glorified death in battle, yet criminalized death at home. To die for the empire was sacred. To die inside it was pollution. Law turned mortality into propaganda. Archaeology confirms the legal obsession. Outside the southern gates, entire necropolises, literally cities of the dead, stretch for miles. Tomb inscriptions read like political manifestos. I was faithful to my master. I served the state. Even in death, Romans spoke the language of obedience. But beneath the rhetoric lies something more haunting: the attempt to sanitize fate. The boundary between purity and corruption became geographic, not moral. Within the walls, temples, theaters, law. Beyond them, bodies, silence, and the invisible price of civilization. You could say the Lex de Sepulchris built the world's first urban zoning code, but it was more than that. It was an act of psychological hygiene. The city itself became a metaphor for perfection. To maintain its illusion, Rome had to export every trace of decay. That obsession with order seeped into religion. Funerary rites demanded precision, certain gestures, exact formulas, the correct distance from the living. Mourners wore dark veils, not just for grief, but for protection. Mourning was treated like contamination. The funeral procession resembled a ritual quarantine. Yet, for all its order, the system failed at the one thing it feared most: forgetting. The very law that expelled death ensured its endurance, because the dead, once excluded, built their own city, visible from every road leading in. Travelers entered Rome through corridors of stone faces, reading epitaphs that whispered, "We still exist." The living passed between two worlds, the illusion of purity and the proof of decay. The law had divided the city, but not its conscience. There's a bitter irony in that division. Rome claimed to protect its gods from death, but in truth, it feared its own mortality. The pomerium became a line not of sanctity, but of denial, a boundary drawn by power to convince itself it could outlive its subjects. That's why the law survived long after the empire fell. Medieval Europe inherited the same terror. Cities from Paris to Florence banned cemeteries within their walls. Church decrees echoed Roman logic: purity within, corruption without. Even modern zoning owes its logic to that ancient fear, the belief that space can be purified by exclusion. In Rome, death was not an end. It was administration. A body was not allowed to simply rest. It had to be placed correctly, like property on a map. The living needed the illusion that their city was eternal, untouched by decay. But the ground kept its own records. Today, archaeologists excavate those boundaries, the trenches where Rome buried its shame. Bone fragments, funeral urns, and inscriptions whisper the truth. The law tried to suppress. The empire that banned death could never escape it, because no decree, no boundary, no marble wall could stop what power most fears: its own reflection in the grave. In Rome, color could kill. The shade of purple you wore could decide whether you dined with senators or died by decree. The dye came from crushed murex sea snails, harvested along the Phoenician coast. Tens of thousands were boiled to make a few drops of Tyrian purple, a hue that shimmered between blood and smoke. The smell was rancid, but the prestige divine. In an empire built on spectacle, appearance wasn't vanity, it was hierarchy. At first, the right to wear purple was a privilege of senators, marked by a narrow stripe on the toga called the clavus latus. But as wealth grew faster than virtue, the boundaries blurred. Merchants and freedmen began imitating their betters. Purple flooded the markets. To the old guard, imitation felt like contamination. If anyone could look noble, then nobility itself might disappear. So the state intervened. Under the Lex Oppia and later imperial decrees, the dye became property of the empire, literally reserved for the gods and the emperor. The law spoke of modesty, but its logic was monopolistic. By outlawing a color, Rome privatized status. Wearing the wrong fabric wasn't merely a fashion offense, it was a political statement. The toga picta, a full-body garment dyed solid purple and embroidered with gold, was worn only by emperors during triumphs. To appear in one without sanction was to impersonate divinity. The punishment was death. Nero enforced the rule with paranoia that bordered on pathology. Historians record his rage at a senator who arrived at a banquet wearing a robe too richly tinted. Before dessert, the man was stripped and humiliated before the guests. Later, he was executed. The message was clear. Beauty unlicensed was rebellion. For Rome, control over color was control over imagination. The empire didn't fear rebellion from swords. It feared rebellion from symbols. To look like power was to threaten it. And yet, beneath this rigid order, an underground economy of beauty thrived. Smugglers trafficked contraband dye from Tyre and Alexandria. Counterfeit merchants concocted imitations from crushed lichens or lead salts. Wealthy women commissioned garments secretly woven with forbidden threads, hidden beneath dull, autor robes. Fashion became resistance, the quiet rebellion of fabric against law. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of this black market vanity. Amphorae with residue of purple pigment, workshops disguised as laundries, and dyes adulterated to avoid imperial scrutiny. The economy of appearance refused to obey, but the empire adapted. When suppression failed, it redefined transgression. Only emperors could be divine, but others could pay to approach divinity. Senators were allowed a single stripe, priests a border, citizens none. Rome learned to calibrate color like taxation. Each rank assigned its visual fraction of holiness. The symbolism ran deep. Purple wasn't just a color. It was theology woven into cloth. It signified proximity to godhood, the same way blood signified life. The emperor's robe, shimmering with golden thread, wasn't fashion. It was liturgy. To question it was to question the cosmic order itself. And yet, that same order devoured itself. By the 2nd century CE, the empire's obsession with appearance became unsustainable. Entire provinces were taxed not in coin, but in dye. Merchants paid bribes to supply imperial wardrobes. The cost of a pound of pure Tyrian wool equaled a soldier's annual wage. The economics of vanity began to mirror the politics of decline. Purple turned from symbol to symptom, the color of power draining itself. The philosopher Seneca, writing under Nero, captured the unease. He mocked his peers for worshipping silk and dye while neglecting the soul. They think virtue can be worn. But he also understood the paradox. When law defines beauty, rebellion must be invisible. The Lex Oppia eventually fell, repealed in name, if not in spirit. But the damage had been done. Rome had taught the world that aesthetics could be legislated, that visibility could be weaponized. Even centuries later, Byzantine emperors wrapped themselves in purple to claim legitimacy. Kings and popes inherited the code. Born to the purple still means born to rule. The dye faded, the ideology did not. Every empire that followed borrowed the trick. Make beauty sacred, and you make hierarchy eternal. But the Romans went further. They understood that if the body could betray status, then luxury itself must be a controlled substance. So they moved from color to substance, from the fabric of status to the weight of silver. What began as a war on vanity would soon become a war on wealth itself. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's problem was no longer war, it was wealth. The Republic had devoured continents, and now it was choking on its own spoils. Senators built villas larger than temples, filled them with marble, fountains, and pet leopards. Gold gleamed from ceilings. Silverware multiplied faster than heirs. The Senate decided that virtue could be restored through restraint, if not of appetite, then of appearance. Thus was born the Lex Licinia, Rome's great anti-luxury law. It limited private silver to 500 pounds, restricted gold jewelry to a few ounces, and banned embroidered garments altogether. On paper, it was a moral crusade. In practice, it was surveillance economics. The oediles, the same inspectors who once weighed meat, now raided homes, rummaging through cupboards, weighing goblets, and cataloguing spoons. Aesthetics became evidence. Imagine the scene. A senator's dining room lit by oil lamps, his table set for guests. A knock at midnight. Inspectors push through the door, their scales clinking, counting each plate as though weighing his soul. They tally, confiscate, and record. The man who wrote speeches about liberty must now plead for his cutlery. Rome, once proud of its law, had turned into its own accountant. But like all systems of moral accounting, it collapsed under the weight of its hypocrisy. The rich didn't stop flaunting. They evolved. Beneath their marble floors, they built hidden vaults where servants stacked silver bowls and golden cups, each labeled for the next feast. Archaeologists in Pompeii and Herculaneum have found them. Perfectly matched dining sets buried under layers of ash, still polished as if waiting for an inspection to end. Luxury didn't disappear. It went underground. This concealment became a performance in itself, a kind of perverse obedience. To appear modest while secretly hoarding was not shameful. It was intelligent. The empire rewarded cunning over honesty. The moral law had invented its own counterculture. Soon, artisans began designing disguised wealth. Silver cups plated to look like bronze, furniture built with compartments, and utensils that could be reassembled to hide their worth. The elite learned to live a double life, pious in daylight, opulent by lamplight. The irony deepened. The same Senate that issued the bans hosted lavish state festivals funded by public money. Banquets celebrating military victories featured fountains of wine, roasted ostriches, and edible gold leaf. The people were told to live simply while watching their rulers dine like gods. It was not hypocrisy by accident, it was policy by design. The Senate understood that scarcity preserved hierarchy. By limiting visible luxury, they made privilege appear rare, and therefore legitimate. The Lex Licinia was not a moral failure. it was a political success. It turned envy into awe. Yet beneath that veneer, the economy strained. The suppression of luxury killed entire trades: silversmiths, jewelers, weavers of fine cloth. Skilled craftsmen were forced to sell their labor in secret. A black market of beauty emerged, thriving on prohibition. Rome had created the ancient equivalent of a luxury mafia. The historian Pliny wrote, with both disgust and fascination. He described senators who melted silver into unrecognizable lumps to avoid confiscation. Wealth pretending to be ruin. Others bribed inspectors to look away, paying for forgiveness in advance. Corruption became the lubricant of virtue. And then there was Nero. The emperor who inherited all these laws ignored them completely. His Domus Aurea, the Golden House, was a palace of deliberate blasphemy. Ivory ceilings, revolving dining rooms, gemstone mosaics, and walls that exhaled perfume. When asked about his extravagance, Nero reportedly said, "Let the people see what a god deserves." The statement was cruel, but honest. For centuries, the Senate had hidden its excess behind decrees. Nero simply dispensed with the mask. He proved what every moral law secretly feared: that power was never ashamed of luxury, only of being caught enjoying it. By then, the inspectors' raids had become ritual. They no longer curbed decadence, they confirmed it. Every confiscation was proof that Rome still had something to confiscate. Every law reaffirmed the illusion that the Republic was still virtuous. The Lex Licinia thus served the same purpose as the earlier Lex Orcia on dinners or the Lex Didia on delicacies: to disguise envy as ethics, to punish desire, not destroy it. If purple had once been a monopoly of visibility, silver became the monopoly of silence. What you owned mattered less than how well you hid it. That psychology outlived the empire. The medieval church inherited the logic, condemning gold chalices while hoarding them in crypts. Renaissance princes forbade ostentation, yet built secret galleries filled with forbidden art. The pattern repeats: moral law as camouflage for power. Rome's experiment in moderation revealed a terrifying truth: that legislation can't erase desire. It can only drive it inward, where it grows more inventive, more secret, and more dangerous. By the time Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in 79 CE, Rome's moral edifice was already ash. The silver hoards discovered centuries later were not merely relics of wealth, they were confessions of fear. Each cup and platter whispered the same story. That virtue, once priced, becomes performance. That the empire which tried to audit sin ended up worshipping its disguise. And if beauty and appetite could be outlawed, what would happen when law itself became an article of faith? Rome was about to discover that belief, like silver, could be polished into power. In Rome, justice had no species. When an ox gored its master, or a dog failed to bark during a murder, it was not an accident. It was guilt, and guilt demanded trial. To a modern mind, the idea seems grotesque: a courtroom filled with senators, priests, and a trembling animal. But to the Romans, it was deadly serious. Law was not meant to comfort the living. It was meant to appease the gods. The principle came from an ancient fear that unpunished blood polluted the city. Any violent death left behind a moral residue, a stain that could infect crops, households, even divine favor. If the killer was unknown or inhuman, the act still had to be purged. So the aediles arrested the offender. Witnesses were summoned. The evidence was read aloud. This ox, by trampling, has spilled blood unjustly. A magistrate presided, often invoking sacred formulas. The verdict was always the same: execution, followed by ritual cleansing of the ground. The animal might be crucified, strangled, or thrown from a cliff. Its carcass was then burned or buried with curses to prevent its ghost from returning. The sentence was not for justice, it was for balance. To the Roman mind, every being, human, animal, or object, had a place in the moral cosmos. A hammer that killed a man in an accident might be ceremonially destroyed. A collapsing building could be cursed to neutralize its crime. Order demanded witnesses, confession, punishment, purification. This logic was ancient, but Augustus refined it. Under his administration, religious law and civic law merged completely. The courts became extensions of ritual. The gods were no longer just spectators, they were stakeholders. What began as piety soon hardened into bureaucracy. Priests documented each trial, recording the offender, the cause, and the sacrifice required. A pig's mistake became a ledger entry. A chicken's silence became evidence of negligence. Rome had turned superstition into paperwork. The historian Aulus Gellius describes one such case: a dog who failed to alert its owner during a night attack. The dog was crucified in the Forum. Passers-by were ordered to watch in silence, a warning that even loyalty could be measured, and failure punished. It is tempting to laugh at the absurdity, but the cruelty was methodical. The Romans were not irrational, they were consistent. If the empire's power rested on law, then nothing, no creature, no accident could exist outside it. That was the real philosophy of Roman order: universality through violence. Crucifixion itself began as an animal ritual before becoming the empire's signature punishment for humans. The spectacle of bodies hanging on wood, birds feeding on the condemned, was originally a theatre of purification, an offering to rebalance the world. The line between religion and law was erased long before Christ turned the cross into symbol. And it did not end with Rome. The same ritual logic infected Europe for centuries. Medieval records show pigs hanged for killing children, goats burned for unnatural crimes, and swarms of locusts excommunicated for devouring crops. The absurdity persisted because it answered a psychological need. Someone, or something, had to be blamed. Blame was the foundation of order. In this sense, Rome's animal trials reveal more about human politics than animal cruelty. They expose how fear of chaos turns into spectacle. Every execution, every ritual, was a public reassurance that the world still obeyed rules, even if those rules had to be invented. It is a kind of administrative theology, the belief that if a crime can be categorized, the gods can be controlled. Yet, there was a deeper, quieter horror beneath it. These rituals taught citizens to equate obedience with holiness. To question law was to invite impurity. To pity the condemned, beast or man, was to side with disorder. The system created perfect spectators, citizens who mistook violence for virtue, ceremony for justice. When later emperors paraded prisoners through the arena, feeding them to lions, the crowd did not see cruelty. They saw continuity. The same cosmic purification now turned into entertainment. The circus was merely a court with better seating. And once again, it worked. The empire's peace, its Pax Romana, was built not on mercy, but on predictability. People obeyed because the world appeared orderly, even if the price of that order was absurdity. The law, having consumed man and beast alike, now reached its ultimate ambition, to extend beyond reason itself. In the Roman imagination, there could be no such thing as innocent suffering. Every pain had to be explained, every disaster prosecuted. It was a civilization addicted to causality, terrified of randomness. The ox that killed by accident, the dog that stayed silent, the building that collapsed. Each reminded Rome that power was never absolute, that chance still ruled the world. The trials were not about punishment, they were about denial. And denial, once institutionalized, becomes faith. By the time the empire turned Christian, the pattern was already set: sin as contamination, salvation through sacrifice. The crucifixion of animals had prepared the stage for the crucifixion of men. Rome had perfected the theatre of purification, and the audience never stopped clapping. But if beasts and objects could be guilty, what about omens themselves? What if guilt could fall from the sky? The next law would give birds the power to veto kings. In Rome, the gods did not whisper, they voted. And sometimes they voted through pigeons. The lex alia et fufia, passed in the late Republic, gave state priests called augurs a terrifying power. They could suspend any political act, an election, a law, even a war, if the omens looked unfavorable. A single bird flying the wrong way could silence the Senate. What began as piety evolved into a system of divine bureaucracy. The sky became an archive, every flash of lightning a signature. A thunderclap could nullify a law. The croak of a raven might halt a campaign. It was the perfect fusion of theology and politics, power outsourced to mystery. But no mystery stays pure for long. The augurs, guardians of divine will, soon became political weapons. Senators discovered that heaven was easy to manipulate. If a vote risked going the wrong way, an augur could simply announce that Jupiter refused the proceedings. Session over. Reform delayed. The gods, conveniently, always agreed with whoever paid their salary. One consul cancelled a major campaign because the sacred chickens refused to eat their grain. A bad omen. Another ignored the same ritual, lost the battle, and was charged with impiety rather than incompetence. In Rome, failure against the gods was a capital offense. Failure against reason was tradition. This was not superstition, it was strategy. The empire's rulers understood that fear of divine chaos was stronger than loyalty to human law. The augural system turned anxiety into governance. Every public act had to be sanctified. Every speech began with ritual silence. Before war, generals studied birds. Before marriage, priests consulted entrails. Even business contracts included oaths under the wings of Jupiter. It was not that Romans were naive. They were pragmatic. Religion was their encryption code, a sacred algorithm that allowed politics to masquerade as destiny. Under the Republic, the system at least pretended to balance. But once emperors arrived, divine signs became instruments of absolute legitimacy. Augustus, ever the political engineer, retained the augurs not to check power, but to endorse it. He himself became Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. From then on, the emperor no longer needed divine approval. He embodied it. The result was astonishing. Law and faith merged so completely that obedience became metaphysical. To oppose the emperor was not treason, it was blasphemy. Roman chroniclers describe entire sessions of the Senate halted by omens. A thunderstorm over the capital could void an election. A dead bird on the steps might force the rescheduling of a trial. Citizens began reading the weather like legislation, decoding lightning bolts for hints of divine mood. The augurs thrived on this uncertainty. Their role was not to interpret truth, it was to manage ambiguity. A favorable omen could be declared invalid, an unfavorable one reinterpreted for a fee. Faith was no longer belief, it was administration. And yet, within this absurd theatre lay a chilling logic. By surrendering decision-making to divine symbols, the Republic absolved itself of guilt. If a war failed, it was Jupiter's will. If a law caused famine, the gods had demanded sacrifice. Bureaucratic divinity became moral anesthesia. It is tempting to see this as ancient folly, but the pattern endures. Every regime that claims destiny speaks Latin in spirit. The language of power still borrows Rome's vocabulary of sanctity, mandate, providence, mission. We no longer consult birds, but we still invoke invisible legitimacy, markets, fate, the will of history. Rome's augurs were not priests of religion, they were priests of uncertainty. They ensured that the empire could never be blamed, because the gods could never be cross-examined. The poet Juvenal captured it perfectly. We fear the gods because we fear admitting we are alone. That was the psychological secret of Rome's endurance. The system made obedience cosmic. The same mechanism appeared in later empires. The divine right of kings, papal infallibility, even the modern cult of national destiny. Each traces its ancestry to the Roman augur watching the sky, turning weather into policy. But every theology of power has a flaw. It must keep producing miracles. When the signs stop appearing, authority begins to crumble. The empire's late centuries were filled with contradictory omens, eclipses before victories, comets after coronations, storms that blessed and cursed in the same breath. The sky itself seemed tired of politics. Philosophers like Lucretius began to mock the entire system. They argued that lightning was physics, not punishment, that birds flew not because Jupiter commanded, but because they had wings. The suggestion was heretical. It stripped law of its divine armor. For centuries, those who doubted the omens were branded impious, even dangerous. But skepticism spread quietly, like a contagion. By the time Christianity rose, the augurs' birds had lost their authority. The gods, once invoked for every law, had gone silent. Yet the habit remained. Every empire still needs something sacred to justify its laws. Rome's legacy was not its pantheon, it was its method. Make the invisible visible, declare it binding, and call it destiny. That is how the empire survived its own contradictions. It never solved the problem of legitimacy, it ritualized it. When the augurs vanished, another priesthood replaced them. This time, they watched not birds, but hearts. Because when omens ceased to control men, love had to. In Rome, even love had a census. Who you married wasn't up to affection or fate, it was up to paperwork. By the early 1st century CE, Augustus had transformed the family into a legal battlefield. The Lex Papia Poppaea and its sister laws dictated who could marry, who could not, and what would happen if you tried. The goal, as the emperor claimed, was moral renewal. But the real purpose was containment, to freeze Rome's hierarchy in place. The empire had a problem that no legion could solve: too much mixing. Slaves freed by rich masters married citizens. Actresses and courtesans won the hearts of senators. Merchants bought their way into aristocracy. The lines between birth and ambition were blurring. For a society built on pedigree, that was chaos. So the state drew new boundaries around love. Senators and their descendants were forbidden to marry freedwomen, actors, or anyone deemed infamis, a legal category that included performers, prostitutes, and those who earned money from spectacle. In theory, the law defended dignity. In practice, it made affection a privilege of rank. If a senator fell for a freedwoman, their union was void. Their children were illegitimate, their property in jeopardy. No priest could bless them, no court would recognize them. Love itself became contraband. The enforcement was as cruel as it was clinical. Inspectors reviewed marriage registers like tax rolls. Witnesses were required to verify purity of bloodline. Marriages that crossed class boundaries were retroactively annulled, as if affection itself could be erased by decree. The historian Tacitus writes of noble families quietly disowning sons who married beneath them, an administrative act as final as execution. It was Rome's quietest cruelty, a bureaucracy of heartbreak. Even emperors were not immune. When Emperor Claudius fell in love with a freed woman named Acte, his advisors panicked. To marry her would violate his own laws. So Claudius did what emperors often did when faced with hypocrisy. He pretended. Officially, the relationship didn't exist. Acta was reclassified as a servant. Behind closed doors, the emperor lived his forbidden marriage in silence. It was a pattern repeated across the empire. Love became invisible. Affection had to disguise itself as duty. Women of lower class, no matter their virtue, were legally branded as temptations, their worth predetermined by ancestry. The word infamis didn't just exclude, it erased. The poets protested, of course. Ovid mocked the absurdity of legislating desire. You can chain the body, not the will. But satire couldn't stop the machinery of order. The Lex Papia Poppaea transformed intimacy into census data. Every kiss risked a legal consequence. Rome had turned its marriages into fortresses. Inside the walls, the elite bred purity like livestock. Outside, the masses mixed and multiplied without recognition. The empire's obsession with hierarchy reached into the bedroom, regulating who could produce the next generation of citizens. It was eugenics before the word existed, an empire's attempt to breed obedience. Behind the moral rhetoric lay an economic truth. Property inheritance required clear lines of legitimacy. Every illegitimate child threatened the transmission of wealth, and thus the illusion of noble virtue. Love was not dangerous because it was sinful. It was dangerous because it confused ownership. To the Senate, affection across class was a tax evasion of blood. The result was social paralysis. Ambitious families married within their own circles, tightening the web of privilege until it strangled itself. Power became hereditary, not earned. The empire ossified. Yet, as always, the law produced its opposite. Forbidden romances flourished. Lovers forged adoption papers, bribed officials to rewrite family records, or staged symbolic unions under false names. The black market of affection mirrored the black market of luxury. Desire, suppressed, became cunning. The irony was complete. The empire that outlawed adultery now criminalized marriage itself. For women, the consequences were devastating. Freed women, no matter how educated or wealthy, were trapped in a limbo between respectability and disgrace. Actresses, the celebrities of their age, were worshipped in art but condemned by law. To be admired publicly was to be untouchable privately. Rome didn't just control women's choices, it weaponized them. Female virtue became state property, a visible index of moral order. A senator's wife embodied Rome's purity, a courtesan its corruption. Both roles served the same function, to make power look moral. The Lex Papia Poppaea endured for generations, its language adapted by emperors and bishops alike. When Christianity rose, it inherited Rome's fear of impurity, simply replacing lineage with faith. The rules of blood became rules of belief. But beneath theology and rhetoric, the core remained unchanged. Love was regulation. The law had found its perfect disguise. By calling restriction virtue, Rome transformed hierarchy into morality. It was not enough to rule bodies. It had to rule affection itself. And if marriage could be weaponized, what about reproduction? If love could be licensed, could fertility be taxed? Augustus thought so, because the next law did not just manage who you loved, it managed how many children you owed the empire. By 9 CE, Rome had reached a moral paradox so deep it could only be solved by arithmetic. If people would not love willingly, they would be forced to breed dutifully. That was the logic behind Augustus's Lex Papia Poppaea, the so-called marriage law. It was not about love, it was about inventory. The empire needed citizens, taxpayers, soldiers, heirs. Desire had to be audited and loneliness fined. Men over 25 who refused to marry faced a steep tax. Those who stayed childless lost the right to inherit property. Celibacy became financial suicide. Marriage was no longer a personal bond, it was a civic investment portfolio. The law's rhetoric was grand. Rome must replenish its moral stock. In reality, the emperor was counting future taxpayers. Births meant conscripts. Conscripts meant conquest. And conquest meant revenue. Augustus turned biology into policy. He was, in many ways, history's first demographer. But his arithmetic was cruel. Wealthy widows were suddenly worth more than gold. Suitors proposed not for love, but for legal relief. Families staged fake weddings, ceremonies without consummation, to qualify for exemptions. Some couples adopted adult children to appear fertile on paper. Others went further. They staged pregnancies, borrowed infants, or bribed scribes to forge birth records. Rome's morality had become a spreadsheet of lies. Poets mocked the spectacle. Ovid quipped that soon men would marry statues to please the treasury. Satirists wrote about ghost brides who appeared only at tax season. But the bureaucracy took none of it lightly. Inspectors reviewed family registries. Informants prowled for false unions. Virgins were questioned about their plans for reproduction. Privacy vanished. Even chastity required documentation. The penalties were severe. A single man caught without legal justification could lose half his estate. A widow who refused remarriage after 2 years faced confiscation of her dowry. The empire punished mourning itself. Grief had an expiration date. Beneath the legislation lay a simple fear: decline. After decades of civil war, the aristocracy was shrinking. The Senate's families, exhausted by luxury and childlessness, risked extinction. Augustus saw the numbers and panicked. His answer was compulsion disguised as morality. In speeches, he framed the law as divine duty. "We are all children of the gods," he declared, "and must continue their lineage." But the gods had nothing to do with it. The Lex Papia Poppaea was a census in disguise, a mechanism to keep property circulating upward, from citizens to state. Every unwed Roman was not immoral. He was unproductive. The emotional cost was immense. Marriage lost its intimacy. Love became logistics. Couples who once chose each other out of affection now calculated fertility as a tax shield. Husbands courted wives like accountants comparing ledgers. Even affection could be audited. Augustus himself enforced the law with theatrical severity. At public games, he lectured bachelors from the stands, calling them traitors to posterity. The crowd cheered, but behind the applause was exhaustion. The emperor who once punished lust now punished loneliness. It was Rome's purest irony. The state that outlawed pleasure now mandated reproduction. The system inevitably collapsed under its own contradictions. The fines raised revenue, but not families. Those who could afford to pay simply remained single. Those who couldn't invented heirs. The more the empire tried to legislate fertility, the less fertile it became. Census records from the early 1st century show a steady decline in legitimate births among the elite. Augustus's successor, Tiberius, quietly stopped enforcing the penalties. But the damage lingered. Love had been nationalized. The family was now a branch office of the treasury. The deeper wound was psychological. By equating intimacy with duty, Rome stripped desire of its spontaneity. To love freely was to risk punishment. To marry strategically was to be rewarded. The human heart had become a public utility. The poet Juvenal, writing a century later, looked back on the law with acid clarity. They taught us to marry for Rome, and so we learned to love no one. That single line captures the empire's descent, from moral ambition to moral emptiness. The Lex Papia Poppaea reveals the hidden machinery of every authoritarian dream. When affection is forced, loyalty follows by habit. It was not about babies. It was about obedience. And obedience, once internalized, is the purest currency of power. By turning the household into a factory of virtue, Augustus built the blueprint for centuries of state-controlled morality. The church would later bless it, monarchs would inherit it, modern governments would still whisper its logic. But Rome's experiment came with a final, haunting irony. The emperor who taxed loneliness died, surrounded by it. His daughter exiled, his heir reluctant, his family line collapsing. The law had produced not renewal, but sterility, moral and biological. It proved a timeless truth. A civilization can conquer everything except the private will of its people. And when the state's obsession with purity reaches its limit, it begins to erase impurity itself, not just from life, but from memory. Because after legislating appetite, love and fertility, Rome turned to its final frontier of control: history. The next law would not punish the body, it would erase the name. Rome's most terrifying punishment did not spill blood, it erased it. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. A sentence not against the body, but against existence itself. If you betrayed the emperor, defied the Senate, or simply became politically inconvenient, you were not merely executed. You were deleted. Your statues were smashed. Your name chiseled off inscriptions. Your portraits burned, your coins melted down. Official documents rewrote the past as if you had never been born. It was the empire's most perfect invention, bureaucratic oblivion. The Romans believed memory was survival. To be named was to remain. Tombs carried inscriptions that began with DM, dis manibus, to the spirits of the dead. The words were a legal guarantee that the soul would persist through remembrance. To remove the name was to annihilate it twice, first in flesh, then in spirit. So when the Senate decreed damnatio memoriae, it wasn't erasure by accident. It was ritual execution of identity. The process was systematic. Sculptors were ordered to gouge eyes from statues, leaving blank sockets where once stood power. Chisels carved across marble inscriptions, scraping until the letters vanished into ghostly scars. Coins were recalled and melted. Mosaics were retiled. History itself was redacted by artisans. The condemned were never only tyrants. Caligula, Nero, Domitian, all branded as monsters, but also senators who fell out of favor, generals who lost, or relatives who knew too much. The decision was often political theater disguised as moral judgment. Each act of erasure proclaimed the same message. Only the empire decided who deserved memory. It was history as bookkeeping. And yet, the more Rome tried to delete, the more conspicuous the deletions became. Archaeologists today find those mutilated inscriptions, the names violently carved out, but the absence still visible, deeper than the surrounding stone. The void became testimony. Every missing word whispered, someone once was here. That is the paradox of damnatio memoriae. In erasing, it immortalized. Nero's colossal statue, once a self-portrait in bronze, was repurposed into the likeness of the sun god. The base remained, the face changed. Rome did not destroy monuments. It recycled them, turning memory into property of the state. Forgetting became an architectural process. Ordinary citizens faced smaller versions of the same punishment. Families could disown disgraced relatives, scratch their names from tombs, and legally deny their descendants inheritance. The condemned were banished not just from Rome, but from lineage. To lose one's memoria was to vanish from every prayer, every ritual offering. In a culture obsessed with ancestral worship, it was spiritual extinction. And yet, beneath its cruelty lay the empire's deepest anxiety. Rome feared not rebellion, but memory, without permission. Every act of erasure was a confession of insecurity, the acknowledgement that even absolute power could not control how it was remembered. The historian Tacitus once wrote, "They make a desert and call it peace." He could just as well have said, "They erase a man and call it justice." But memory is stubborn. The scratches remained. The gaps provoked curiosity. Historians and poets recorded the absences precisely because they were forbidden to. The more Rome tried to bury its sinners, the louder their ghosts spoke. Centuries later, the very emperors condemned by damnatio memoriae, Nero, Caligula, Domitian, became immortal in infamy, while their accusers faded into footnotes. Rome discovered the futility of legislating oblivion, that the act of censorship is itself a record. The philosopher Seneca saw the irony clearly. "You can erase names from stone," he wrote, "but not from the breath of men." Still, the system endured. Later emperors used it liberally, even preemptively. To fear was to erase. To forget was to govern. The practice became the empire's subconscious reflex, a bureaucratic instinct to rewrite discomfort. Modern historians call it propaganda, but the Romans were more honest. They called it purification. They treated history itself as a moral body. If disease appeared, you amputated the limb. What they never understood was that memory, unlike flesh, resists surgery. The wound becomes the story. Even Christianity inherited the instinct. Heretics were burned, their names cursed, but the record of their erasure survived in the very lists meant to destroy them. The Roman habit of deletion became the Church's method of canonization through exclusion. That is the final paradox of empire. The more it tries to curate eternity, the more it exposes its fragility. When Rome outlawed memory, it crossed its last frontier of control. It had already taxed desire, censored love, and outlawed luxury. Now it sought to command history itself. But history is never obedient. It remembers through ruins. Today, in museums, fragments of erased inscriptions sit under glass. Visitors lean close to read what no longer exists. Traces of chisel marks, ghosts of letters. They look at nothing and see everything. Those blank spaces are the empire's truest legacy. Proof that no law, no empire, no god can legislate remembrance. Rome tried to kill memory and made it immortal. By the time Rome finished writing laws for everything, there was almost nothing left to live for. It had legislated appetite, intimacy, luxury, death, and finally, memory. It was a civilization obsessed with purity, and purity, taken to its extreme, is annihilation. What began as discipline had become compulsion. Every decree, from the lex orcia to damnatio memoriae, followed the same logic: to control corruption by perfecting order. But order is a fragile drug. The higher the dose, the more poisonous it becomes. Rome wanted moral clarity and achieved moral paralysis. The Republic's early laws, those that limited banquets, marriages, jewelry, were born of anxiety, not faith. The Senate feared indulgence, but feared disorder even more. Law became a sedative, a way to tranquilize the conscience. By the empire's height, that sedative had turned into a straitjacket. Every law fed on the next. The regulation of appetite justified the policing of desire. The policing of desire justified the taxation of love. And when love failed to reproduce virtue, the state tried to tax fertility itself. When even that failed, Rome punished remembrance. This is not a history of laws. It is the biography of obsession. The Romans believed they were preserving civilization from chaos. In truth, they were preserving power from accountability. Every moral statute hid an economic motive: to protect elite privilege, to confine mobility, to convert guilt into obedience. Their system was brilliant in its cruelty. The Senate built virtue into hierarchy, the emperor built surveillance into devotion, and the citizens, exhausted, complicit, learned to live by pretending. The philosopher Epictetus warned of this illusion. He who fears to err has already lost his freedom. Rome turned that fear into policy. It outlawed the unpredictable, the spontaneous, the human. What was left was choreography, a civilization of actors trapped inside its own script. Even religion became regulation. Temples operated like ministries, priests like auditors. The gods themselves were bureaucrats in heaven's ledger. Jupiter's will resembled a Senate decree. The sacred and the administrative had merged into one machinery of control. That machinery was astonishingly efficient and catastrophically hollow, because the one thing it could not legislate was faith itself. Augustus had tried to recreate virtue by decree, but laws cannot inspire belief. They can only imitate it. And imitation, once exposed, breeds cynicism. By the 2nd century, cynicism was the empire's real religion. Citizens obeyed because rebellion was inconvenient. They married for tax relief, sacrificed for show, prayed for safety. Virtue had become performance, piety a receipt. The poet Lucan saw it clearly. We call this peace, but it is silence. That silence was the sound of exhaustion. A civilization that feared its own freedom had finally achieved safety, at the cost of soul. The irony is almost elegant. Rome began by trying to protect the Republic from decay. It ended by embalming itself alive. The moral order it worshipped became its tomb. The law against indulgence buried its appetite. The law against adultery buried its intimacy. The law against luxury buried its creativity. The law against death buried its humanity. And the law against memory buried its truth. It outlawed everything that made life worth defending. When the empire finally fractured, its ruins were not just political, they were psychological. The citizens no longer remembered how to disobey. They had internalized the censor. That is Rome's true legacy. Not roads or aqueducts, but the invention of internal surveillance. The Roman citizen learned to police himself long before the state had to. And that idea, the moralization of obedience, survived the empire. It passed through Christianity, through monarchies, through every modern bureaucracy that calls control a virtue. The language changed, the instinct did not. To this day, every government that criminalizes dissent in the name of purity, every algorithm that rewards virtue signaling over honesty, speaks fluent Latin. Rome's death was not a fall. It was a slow self-erasure, a civilization that tried to live without contradiction and perished from sterility. When the last emperors signed decrees banning pagan rites, censoring art, or rewriting chronicles, they believed they were saving Rome's soul. They were, in truth, writing its obituary. Because no empire can survive the moment it begins to fear its own humanity. The laws that once promised eternity had become suicide notes, precise, rational, beautifully worded instruments of decay. In trying to perfect itself, Rome outlawed itself. When Rome fell, it did not vanish. It sublimated. Its stones crumbled, but its structure, the idea that order could sanctify power, survived. It slipped into churches, monarchies, constitutions, algorithms. Rome did not end. It digitized. For centuries, historians asked, why the greatest empire in history died? The answer is simpler. Rome did not die. It was canonized. The empire that once ruled through law began to rule through belief. Belief that law is sacred. That was the final metamorphosis, when law became God. The blueprint was already perfect by the time the Caesars were gone. The Senate's moral decrees had shown that legislation could replace conscience. The emperor's divine titles proved that obedience could masquerade as faith. And the Damnatio Memoriae taught that truth itself could be managed like a public resource. The Church merely adopted the template. It replaced emperors with popes, omens with revelation, augurs with theologians. Sin became the new treason. Confession replaced taxation. The same architecture remained, only the vocabulary changed. Rome had built the software of control, and history kept reinstalling it. When medieval kings claimed to rule by divine right, they were quoting Augustus in translation. When inquisitors burned heretics for the purity of the faith, they were enforcing the lex fania on desire, the lex didia on taste, the lex Julia on thought. Even modern democracies inherit the reflex to legislate morality when belief falters. The illusion persists that virtue can be engineered, that obedience can be holy. But every copy of Rome inherits its virus, the confusion between order and meaning. Once law is worshipped, justice becomes irrelevant. Once obedience is moralized, tyranny feels righteous. That was Rome's genius, and its curse. It built a system so logical, so self-justifying, that even collapse looked like discipline. When barbarians breached the gates, Rome told itself it was purification, another ritual of cosmic balance. In its final breath, it believed it was still obeying law. The ruins confirm it. Inscriptions praising order carved above empty tombs. Decrees of virtue found in cities that starved. It was a civilization dying of its own symmetry. Yet, its shadow endures. Every time a government says it must protect values, Rome speaks. Every time a leader demands purity before freedom, Rome answers. Every time a society trades truth for moral comfort, a senator's ghost smiles. Because the Roman secret was never brutality, it was sanctity. They understood that power lasts longer when disguised as virtue. Whips rust, swords dull, but guilt endures. Guilt became the empire's most exportable technology. In that sense, Rome won. It conquered time. Its greatest monument is not the Colosseum, nor the aqueducts, but the invisible architecture inside our heads. The belief that law and goodness are the same thing. We inherited the empire's faith in rules, its worship of procedure, its terror of ambiguity. We still measure worth in compliance, still build hierarchies out of virtue, still mistake order for morality. We are, in a sense, Rome's last citizens, obeying long after the empire is gone. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The same civilization that outlawed memory ensured its own immortality. The laws meant to erase sin became the records of it. The inscriptions meant to purify power became archaeology's proof of corruption. Rome failed at control, but succeeded at legacy. Today, the marble is silent, but the logic speaks fluently in data, surveillance, and social conformity. We no longer fear augurs or inspectors, only algorithms. The faces have changed, but The mechanism is identical, a system that promises safety in exchange for silence. Rome's moral police raided dinner tables. Our age polices feeds, words, and screens. The same ritual continues. The purification of public space through invisible law. We call it progress. They called it virtue. It is the same liturgy with new vocabulary. There is, however, one escape that Rome never managed to outlaw: remembrance. For every erased name, a chisel mark remained. For every forbidden poem, a fragment survived. For every silenced voice, an echo endured in stone. The empire tried to control eternity. History, as always, refused to cooperate, because memory is rebellion. And rebellion, the refusal to forget, is the only true virtue law cannot regulate. So when we look back at Rome, we are not looking at ruins. We are looking at a mirror. An empire that outlawed appetite, affection, and imagination, and called it civilization. A mirror that asks us the same question Augustus once answered with legislation. What happens when power mistakes obedience for order? The answer is written across every broken statue, every carved-out name, every silence that still screams. When law becomes God, the living become relics. If you value the record, remember this. Rome's greatest monument was not its empire, but its illusion. That morality can be manufactured, and control can be eternal. It was wrong. When the ledger finally closed, the bones still spoke.